Thank you for inviting me to present this work. I am a speech and language therapist. I work here in Dublin in Beaumont Hospital within the MND multidisciplinary clinic. And this is a project done with Caroline Jago, who works in Trinity College Dublin within the Department of Clinical Speech and Language Studies. So Caroline and I both attended a course on message banking by our message banking guru, John Costello, who's our next speaker, back in 2012. And we've been carrying out message banking clinically since then. We think it's a very valuable clinical tool, but because it's something that's still new, it's, I suppose, an optional intervention. We wanted to look and see if we could in some way quantify the clinical value of message banking. So just to declare that our research is funded by Research Motor Neuron, which is an Irish-based organisation. So just thinking about communication, our ability to have such complex communication, it's one of the factors that really defines our humanness. And we're not just expressing words, but we're expressing ourselves, our identity when we speak. When people have speech disorders, they can really withdraw from social interaction. And that's not just because it's hard to understand their speech, but it's because that sense of identity has been challenged. We all know that speech disorders is one of the more distressing aspects of MND. Often people assume that as MND progresses, the need for communication is just to communicate wants and needs, but actually a lot of the time carers can guess those things because they're quite frequent, or they can be communicated with gesture. In the work by Joan Murphy back in 2004, she found that social closeness was the most important purpose for communication amongst people with MND and their partners at home. So communication devices are such a lifeline, as we know, and we've seen in the previous presentation for people with MND. For some people, it can be quite a difficult and a challenge to make that transition. There's a lot of factors. Sometimes it's just the fact that it's a major milestone, but for some people, the voice output on devices is a factor. We've come such a long way in the last few years. There's really such an improved range and quality of synthesized voices, but it can be difficult to match for gender, for accent, for age. For example, in my setting, there is no Irish male voice available, so people have to decide if they're going to be Moira, the female Irish voice, or if they're going to have a UK British voice. So because of that, it can be difficult for the person to feel like it represents them, and also we know that intonation is still difficult in that expression of emotion. So this leads us to message banking, and can we use message banking to try and meet some of those challenges? So I'm going to use the words of John Costello, who's really described and defined message banking as a clinical tool. So message banking is the intervention whereby patients with progressive conditions record phrases that can later be used on electronic communication devices. These messages, recorded in the patient's own voice, have an important role both in optimizing communication, but also maintaining a sense of self and the individual's identity as a communicator. So some examples of phrases that our people recorded are here, and one person described it as, you don't need to record everything, just the phrases that are close to your heart or close to your family's heart, and phrases that tell a story. So, for example, there's one there saying, is the cat in or out, which sounds like quite a standard phrase, but actually for this lady in her house, the cat rules the house. If anything happened, the cat was the #1 suspect, so if something went missing, the first question asked would be, is the cat in or out? So for her, that was very personal. So we had been using message banking clinically, and we'd also carried out a focus group with some of our people who had completed it, and some things were quite clear. One of the things coming through was that message banking really promoted independent and informed decision making. So people were more proactive about making their own choices for communication devices when they'd done message banking, rather than just relying on the SLT or assistive technology expert advice. It created choice, and that choice was very important. So for some people, they actually decided not to use their messages when they were using an electronic device, but having the messages there and knowing that they were literally in the bank had value in and of itself. And also, certainly in Ireland, we don't have any standard guidelines, and depending on where the person lives, they might get different advice. So it was really coming through the need to have some more standardized guidelines. So what we did was we designed a study. So we used a single subject design and we incorporated some qualitative and quantitative measures. We included some group discussion as we carried out message banking as an intervention, so we could get the opinions and preferences of participants in various aspects of the process. And what we plan to do is have a message banking toolkit for Irish SLTs, and we really wanted to be that to be driven by the service user, so that we were making an intervention that was what they wanted rather than what we thought they might want. So we then also used some self-rating scales to measure change as we carried out the message banking intervention. So we used the fixed baseline design that's advocated by Howard, and we followed, we did that at 5 baseline time points over 2 weeks, and then followed that by 4 intervention group meetings over 2-week time points, and we carried out our baseline or our measures at each of those groups as well. And then we have a 2-week follow-up, and we plan to have a 1-year follow-up when we anticipate some people might actually be using their messages at that point. So we administered the ALSFRS as our control measure because we anticipated that there wouldn't be a huge amount of change within our brief time points of the baseline and the intervention. And then we used the ALSSQOL, the Herth Hope Index, and the Adult State Hope Scale, which are validated tools. And we also designed our own expectations of questionnaire, or of message banking questionnaire, which we haven't reported on here. So unfortunately, we found it quite difficult to recruit for this study. We found a lot of people clinically interested in message banking, but they didn't choose to take part in the study. So we've only got 3 participants to report on so far. So this is quite preliminary, but we do hope to repeat this with another 6 to 8 people. So we used a group protocol, so we delivered our message banking intervention within a group format, which was very popular with the participants. And at each session we had a new skill training, so using the recording devices, choosing phrases, sorting, organising, and then some other tools when they had the bulk of that done. We sent them off after each group to go and independently carry out each part. They came back and we reflected on that and did a lot of problem solving. Most of the problem solving was relating to choosing messages to record or going through your messages and deciding which ones really were important in your own voice or would be okay to have in the synthesized voice. So the ALSSQOL, for anyone not familiar with it, it's a specific quality of life questionnaire for ALS, and there's a long form. We use the brief form of 20 questions. So you're asked to rate how strongly you agree with these statements over the past week. So for example, I have experienced fatigue, I have felt supported, I have felt depressed. So our findings on this, you can see each participant is represented with a separate graph. There was some fluctuations in, we have represented the baseline period on the left-hand side. So that's the area in the shaded grey, and the area in the white plot is the intervention period. So there was some fluctuation in the ALSFRS for participant 1 and 2. So it's hard to just look at the graph and compare the baseline to the intervention. So we used weighted statistics rate of change method to calculate any significance in the change of scores during the baseline period compared to the intervention period. And what we found, there wasn't a significant change in participant 1, but there was significance in participant 2 and 3. So the quality of life scores changed significantly during that period compared to during the baseline period. So in terms of our hope scales, we looked at the Herth Hope Index, which is an ALS specific, but it is used in research to quantify how effective interventions to increase sense of hope are for people in a medical setting. So again, you're asked to rate how true statements are for you right now. So I feel all alone, I have deep inner strength, I believe that each day has potential. And we also use the Adult State Hope Scale. So the Adult Hope Scale has a state and a trait section, and we use the state section. So again, this looks at a sense of setting and achieving goals that a person has. So you're asked to rate how true statements are for you right now. So for example, at the present time, I am energetically pursuing my goals. I can think of many ways to reach my current goals. So we combine the results of these because they're both looking at similar concepts. And again, there were some fluctuations, so we used the weighted statistics rate of change calculations. And you can see participant 1, there wasn't a significant difference between our baseline and our intervention. For participant 2, there was significance within the rate of change during the intervention. And for participant 3, it was significant on the Herth Hope Index, and while there was a positive increase for the adult or the hope scale, it wasn't significant. I do think it's worth noting for participant 1, while we didn't find significance, the rating at the beginning was actually very high. You can see the lines are up towards the top of the graph, and they're maintained high throughout. And this was a person who was very verbally enthusiastic about message banking and was really keen to carry it out, and actually just jumped at the chance of doing it within the group format. So it could be for this person that just enlisting in this study gave a boost to the quality of life rating. So I'm just going to read you a couple of quotes just to give a sense of what this meant to our participants. So this is in response to asking, what does message banking mean to you? If you think about how you convey your personality, it's through your voice, your facial expression, and your gestures. And MND takes all of those away from you potentially. So if you can't retain, if you can't move your facial muscles, you can't express. And if you can't move your arms, you can't gesture. And if you lose your voice, you can't, convey your sentiments. So at least having the message banking there, you are trying to retain a small portion of that rather than just a synthesized voice. You don't want to lose everything. The idea of personality and control came out quite strongly. So for example, for me, it's like hanging on to a little piece of my own personality after I can't communicate. Certain things I would say, the way I would address my wife. To have your voice instead of using machine and someone else speaking, being the synthesized voice, it makes it more comforting, and it makes you feel like you're still in charge a little, And the idea of choice, again, came out quite strongly. This was from a person who actually didn't have any dysarthria at the time of recording. Definitely for anybody that thinks, oh, but sure, that mightn't happen, you mightn't need it. No, but well, it will be there on hand if I do need it, if it does affect my speech and I can't communicate. I want to participate in a conversation and people to hear me, even if it's only part of me. And then we also found that family opinion was quite a strong motivator for people as well. Then there's the wife saying, explaining to me how important it is for her to try and retain some of the quotes and phrases and expressions that I use that I probably don't even think about because I've been doing them my whole life. But for her, it was very important for me to try and retain that for that day if I do lose my voice completely. So it's early stages and it's very hard to draw any strong conclusions from such small numbers, but we clearly see that message banking is very meaningful to people who carry it out. It's hard to measure hope and quality of life in isolation in just one small area in such a broad condition. And possibly that invisible impact of enrolling on the study itself gave a boost to some of our findings. But our qualitative data definitely suggests that there's significant value placed not just on the outcome, but the process of doing it in itself. All of our people were just in the process of recording. Nobody is actually using their messages yet. It's not likely to be for everybody. For some people, it's just too emotionally sensitive. But the value of this as a clinical intervention is that aspect of sense of control, that people are being proactive, not just reactive to things that are happening to them, that they're creating a choice for themselves. So if they don't use these messages, it's because they've decided not to, rather than because they didn't have the opportunity to record or nobody told them. And also that all-important sense of maintaining personality and identity. So finally, just to say our next step, we have our group transcripts. So started to code that data and look at the themes so that we're really going to use that information to guide ourselves on the intervention or our toolkit that we come up with. So after a lot of looking and trying to code, it really boils down to why people do it, when they do it, what they choose to record, and how they go about the process. And that's the part, I suppose, at the moment is still evolving. And we hope we will repeat this with at least another 6 to 8 people and then have our 1-year follow-up. Thank you.
Thank you, and now there's time for questions. There are 2 standing mics, but also someone will, if you're in the middle, you don't have to get up and force your way out. I'm not seeing any. Oh, there we go. Yes.
Lesley, can I ask about patients who have some initial dysarthria? So their voice is already different, even if it's just a little different. How has your experience been on their kind of perception of using that voice? Have they still been happy enough to use it, or do they feel it's, you know, it's already not them?
I think it's very personal to the person. And when anybody asks me, how do I know if it's too late to record or not? The answer is, well, that's down to you to decide. If you're happy with your speech as it is now, you feel if you heard that playing that represents you, then go ahead. And I think that's for the person themselves to decide. So maybe doing some sample recording, letting them hear it, and then letting them decide. Maybe John is a better person to answer that question. If you have any opinion on that.
My personal experience is similar to yours. It's very individualized, but we have many people who have impacted speech, who've message banked, and are now functionally using those incorporated into technology.
Yeah.
But it was their decision that reflection of self was still really important, and it was clear enough that they wanted to use that.
Yeah, and I think often people are more open to even thinking about it and acting on it when they have noticed some slight speech changes, because otherwise they're thinking, but that mightn't happen. So I think maybe that's more of a motivator for people to actually get going and do it, even if at the back of their head they're thinking maybe.
Anyone else? I actually had a question. Back to the, there's no Irish male voice?
There's not, no.
So is there a push to get that? Like, are they reaching out to the companies to say?
I don't know if it's to do with the technology, because looking down through them, there's a lot of versions of female voices of different regional accents. So standardly, you'll get the British, the American, the Australian, and then other, definitely from English accents, there's female versions. So sometimes we've tried to play around and lower the pitch or that, but it doesn't really work very well. So I mean, I would love to see it.
Maybe we should all reach out to the company. Everyone here, write them a letter.
I know there's Irish female, I think there's Welsh, Scottish, South African, so maybe if we all joined forces for our male counterparts, we might get somewhere.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you
Okay,
very
thank
much.
you.